Hello folks, this week saw the launch of a fresh wave of Legion Remix testing as the development team tried to address player feedback from the first round, which raised significant issues with leveling speed, power progression and overly grindy reward acquisition. I'm going to be taking a look at what changes have been introduced and how well they address that feedback, along with a few more small updates for Midnight, so stay tuned. But before I dive into all of that, there are a few updates from the live game that are worth taking a look at. Hidden away inside the usual rounds of hotfixes was an update for Mythic Plus. This is something that's not going to have very much impact on most people's Mythic Plus progression, but it could make it a little bit smoother to onboard new players and new characters to the system. From now on, in Mythic Plus 2 and Plus 3 keys, player deaths are not going to have any impact on the timer, something that will be implicitly signalled by removing the death counter from the user interface for these keys. Now, for those of us who do a lot of mainstream Mythic Plus, we're pretty much used to 2 or even 3 chesting those type of keys, so this will probably feel a little bit pointless. But if you've ever pogged keys at this level in the mid to late season on a fresh ult, then you'll know that you can still land in groups which can seriously struggle when doing them. And those struggles, when they do happen, usually tend to revolve a lot more around survival issues than speed. With the current Mythic Plus dungeon pool now consistently having respawn points at pretty much every boss, wipes are a lot less punishing than has been the case in the past. And this change will make it a lot more likely that if you do end up landing in a key like this, you'll still be able to get something useful out of it. And this should mean that people will be less inclined to vote to abandon, hopefully making the experience a little better for new players who are trying to dip their toes into Mythic Plus. And staying on the subject of trying to improve that Mythic Plus experience, and it appears that Blizzard may be looking at ways to try and incentivize a lot more players to start creating their own groups in LFG. From time to time, Blizzard do issue surveys to selected groups of players. These surveys are supposed to be confidential, and that Blizzard always ask that the recipients don't share them online, but of course most of them do end up being shared anyways. These surveys often give little insights into things that the development team are currently at least considering. For example, both Wrath of the Lich King and Cataclysm Classic were first mooted in surveys. And it is worth saying though that we do sometimes also see some fake surveys. For example, there was one that looked at new player classes but had descriptions that were so similar to existing specializations that it was kinda obvious that it was not a real survey. But in this particular survey, there aren't any obvious red flags, so I do think it is worth taking a serious look at it. The first survey question basically asks about automatic looking for dungeon style matchmaking, which is interesting as the development team in recent interviews seem very hard set against this idea. I'm personally not a huge fan of random matchmaking. Looking for dungeon in LFR can be a little toxic at times. There are plenty of tales out there of brand new players getting vote kicked by pre-made in their first ever dungeon runs. And I do feel that the higher stake of people wanting to effectively farm their weekly vaults for gear could well be a recipe for trouble. The biggest single problem when it comes to pugging groups in Mythic Plus currently is a severe lack of tanks and healers, and I don't think a random queue system would improve that at all. Most likely, the outcome would just be horrendous queue times, something that is already a major issue for solo shuffle. The remainder of the questions though are a bit more interesting, as these are focused on possible improvements for the creators of groups, with some interesting ideas, including making their key resilient for the first group that they create every week, offering bonus crests of Valor Stones, a recommendation system to help highlight players of a similar skill level, or recommending players with similar goals. In the Midnight interviews, the developers mentioned a couple of times a desire to make improvements to the group finder to make it easier to share the goals of groups, and that does fit well into the last two options that they offer in this survey. But the one about bonus Valor Stones is a little bit surprising to me, given that in a Mr. GM interview with game director Ian Hazzikostas, it was strongly suggested that Valor Stones will be going away in Midnight. Overall though, I'm personally not sure that any of these proposed changes would have much impact on people creating their own group listings. While creating your own group is often presented as the easy answer to all of your LFG woes, in reality, creating a group listing puts you in the hook for figuring out group comps, who to choose and who not to choose, and this is something that is clearly not for everyone. That said, I do think that there is a lot of merit in better tools to match people's expectations, as is traditional now that the race to World First is over and we've got our first round of major nerfs to the raid. However, somewhat surprisingly, these are not targeting the Mythic difficulty, and instead are focusing in smaller group sizes, especially 10-man groups in normal and heroic difficulty. As well as this, LFR and story mode Dimentious have had some significant mechanical simplifications. Dimentious has proven to be a bit of a pug killer in LFR, and it personally took me 2 attempts at story mode when I tried it, so I think this fight was definitely overcooked in those difficulties, and these adjustments are for sure needed. What has surprised me though is the lack of changes to Mythic Dimentious, which is getting a reputation as possibly the hardest final raid boss of all time. Anyways, let's get on to this week's Legion Remix update. In response to some fairly widespread dissatisfaction from the last Legion Remix test, which can be best summed up as being slower and more time gated than Mpre Remix, Blizzard have launched a raft of pretty major changes which are currently being tested on the PTR. One of the key complaints was the time it took to level up, the TLDR being that it felt too much like the current retail leveling speed. And this is an area that has got some fairly substantial improvements, thanks to a series of stacking XP buffs. We'll be getting a total of 20% from the intro campaign, followed by an extra 10% at level 40, and an incredible 250% at level 70. And if you choose to use the new Heroic World tier for leveling, which is realistically accessible from level 25, you get an additional buff of 500%. In the normal world tier, the overall impact is to roughly half the leveling times below 70, and to reduce the 70 to 80 leveling time to a quarter of what it previously was. And if you decide to use the Heroic World tier, the leveling speed is now roughly similar to the normal one, so it does seem that the developers have done a decent job of offsetting the effects of that increased difficulty. This has served to make the experience of leveling between 70 and 80 a lot more pleasant, as previously that was one area that really did feel like a bit of a slog. Now, whether or not this new leveling speed will be fast enough, I think will depend on you as a player. For people for whom the fun of Remix comes from stomping through dungeons and raids at max level, I suspect there is still going to be a lot of frustration, albeit that will be dependent on how doable the raids are in sub-level 80 characters. But for players like me who are a lot more interested in farming bronze for collectibles and just experiencing the story in order halls, I think it will probably end up feeling pretty okay. But at the same time, I'm not sure that the new Heroic World tier will be very attractive for leveling. As well, it now does take a similar amount of time to the normal tier. The increased challenge does bring with it increased mental effort and risk, and I'm not convinced that the rewards, at least when leveling up, stack up to make it feel worthwhile. The other major point of criticism was the difficulty scaling, which in the first test did have some jarring difficulty jumps at certain levels, and overall did make the experience feel pretty grindy, especially as you got into higher levels. And this is another area that has got some love, with some major adjustments to that scaling to reduce difficulty in normal world tier, normal dungeons and LFR, along with the removal of diminishing returns from the artifact weapons infinite power trait, and some reduced costs for obtaining your second artifact active ability. Add in dungeons getting a 40% health and 50% damage reduction, and a halving of the power of bolstering, along with a bunch of other changes to the heroic world tier, and I do think that people should find that the progression does now feel a lot better. Unfortunately though, there are a couple of points of criticism that I think have not yet been addressed. The first of these is the relative pacing of the content, as the development team have decided, at least for now, to stick with their phased release approach, despite a lot of pushback from the community. And this does still remain a bit of a point of discontent for many players. Now this wasn't a major surprise to me, as changing this would likely have had a lot of undesirable knock-on effects. One of the reasons that releasing all of the content at once worked in Mpre was the upgrade system on the gear, which meant that all of the raid was able to have a very similar baseline of gear drops. In contrast, the fixed item level drops of Legion Remix lends itself much better to having the different Legion raid tiers offering increasing item level drops. And this means that of all of those tiers released at once, it could have led to players just noping out of some of the raids, especially Emerald Dream, and skipping instead to the hardest one they could do in day one. Avoiding this would require some very serious reworks to the rewards. And with likely only a month or less left to go until the feature launches and live, it is questionable if the Remix dev team would have had the time and capacity to have done this. The other major point of player contention that has, I think, not been fully addressed is the massive inflation in the cost of cosmetic rewards, with the total costs of rewards increasing from 800,000 bronze in Mpre to 4.6 million in Legion Remix. A major part of the reason behind this is that we no longer need to spend our bronze in upgrades as well. But this does mean that it does have a disproportionate impact on players like myself, who don't really have the desire to juggle raiding and Mythic Plus progression in both Remix and the live game, preferring instead to focus just on leveling and story completion. In Mpre, I was able to get all of the mounts I wanted just by leveling up 2 characters and running them through the whole story campaign, something which felt really satisfying. Now, of course, a lot is going to depend on the ultimate bronze drop rates, but at the moment, Legion Remix does look like it's going to be a rather severe grind for more casual collectors. Now, to be sure, there is some appeal to doing all of the Order Hall campaigns, which will require rolling one of every class, but redoing the Legion leveling zones up to 12 times in just 2 to 3 months, I think could end up feeling pretty dull. Now, if you're someone who does plan to raid in Legion Remix, then the news is a little bit better, because you will benefit from increased bronze drops from your raid bosses. But for non-raiders like me, the main hope is currently in the promised increases to bronze drops in the heroic world tier, along with the first withered training run of the day. Now, of course, this isn't my first rodeo, and Blizzard have a long history of being far too stingy with reward drops, only to end up having to massively buff them post-launch. So I do think that there is a very good likelihood that they will get significantly improved at some point later on. Now, what this means overall for Legion Remix is actually a bit of a mixed picture. It has been sped up quite a bit, and I think that for players who want to go into the end game, it will very likely feel smoother and a lot more rewarding. But on the other hand, there is a risk, I think, of at least some players dropping off in Phase 2 and especially Phase 3 due to the time gating, with only a subset of the player base returning for the final phases when all of the content is available. I think that the underlying issue is a mismatch between the expectations of developers who see Remix as a platform in which to experiment, and the player base who were looking for a repeat of Mpre and instead have got something that feels very different. And if anything, the biggest mistake of the development team has been to use the same name for 2 formats which, at least to players, don't feel like they're really the same thing. Now, it wasn't just Remix in this week's PTR though, as the development team have also slipped in a fairly substantial 20% nerf for most of the Titan Disc belt effects, which will also be launching with patch 11.25. Currently, the Disc belt is locking out a gear slot for most, if not all, specializations, at least until you get an upgraded Mythic belt. And even then, that's a questionable upgrade for some players. This change to the belt will, I think, pretty much guarantee that an upgraded hero or myth track belt will now be an upgrade for pretty much everyone, especially with the extra upgrade tiers that we'll be getting from Turbo Boost, and perhaps for some specializations, even a fully upgraded champion belt will now be worth equipping. What this does mean that if you've been avoiding belts, you may want to seriously start considering getting yourself one and sticking it in your bank for the launch of the new patch. And if you've already vendored one, it is worth saying that you can recover them thanks to the self-service item restoration tool, which I will link to down below. If you do need to use item restoration, then I would suggest you do it as soon as possible, as its user interface isn't the best, and the older an item is, the harder it can be to dredge it back up. And finally for this week, the World of Warcraft team have now released a series of catch-up articles for Midnight, along with a brand new information hub, which very nicely brings together all of the information from the Gamescom reveal. For the most part, it is just a recap of what we already know, but with that information from Gamescom being so scattered, it's not hard to have missed some key details, so I would still recommend giving it a look, and again I will link it down below. And if you're a Demon Hunter fan, it is particularly worth taking a look, as it now includes a much expanded summary of that new specialisation. As you might expect though, it does also include a few minor clarifications and additions. One very surprising reveal at Gamescom came from a Taliesin and Evitel interview, where it was at least heavily implied that the exterior design of our new homes, which have human, orc, night elf and blood elf options, at least at launch, would be faction agnostic, meaning for example that you could have potentially have seen an Elwyn Forest human house in the Horde housing area. Now for those of you in the Horde side who are not keen in orc roundhouses, the bad news is that the housing summary did include an explicit update that this is not going to be the case. Housing exteriors will be faction locked, with human and night elf exteriors for the Alliance and orc and blood elf for the Horde. As exterior options are expanded in future, there will eventually be some neutral options too, and these will be available for both factions areas. But any additional faction-specific options will also be faction-locked. The other new addition was a couple of new user interface features for the cooldown manager, the first of which is the personal resource bar. This is going to be removed from a player's nameplate and will be rolled instead into the new cooldown manager. With the recent announcements of improvements to the cooldown manager, which are going live in 11.2.5, resource tracking is now the one remaining missing feature, and bringing it into the cooldown manager will, I think, make this a much more attractive replacement for the very popular weak aura HUDs like Luxthos. And I'm fairly confident that I personally will be using it in at least some of my ults in Midnight. The other user interface addition in Midnight is also for the cooldown manager, and that's going to be the ability to track target debuffs, highly useful for dot classes like Druid, along with defensive externals, a big bonus for healers. I've been very pleasantly surprised by the broad scale and scope of what has been announced for Midnight in terms of user interface additions, including nameplates and the new boss timeline tool. And it really does feel like the World of Warcraft dev team are going all in and trying to capture the core functionality of combat-based add-ons. There is, I think, a genuine desire in the player base to reduce our reliance on user interface add-ons. You just need to look at how many people moved away from the likes of Elf UI following the user interface revamp in Dragonflight, and I do think that after a ropey start with the first rushed and incomplete iteration of the cooldown manager, the developers are very much on the right track here. The final remaining gap in the user interface offering is group unit frames, which, especially for healers, the current version in my opinion is simply unfit for purpose. And hopefully this is something that is on the dev team's radar for one of the later Midnight patches, as if they can deliver something there that is as well thought out as what has been announced so far, this could end up being a bit of a tipping point for a more widespread adoption of a more stock user interface at all levels of the player base. And that's it for this week. Have you tried out the Legion Remix improvements? If so, are they working out for you? And if not, do these changes make you more likely to give Legion Remix a go when it releases? Let me know down below. If you found this update helpful, entertaining, and even just plain annoying, then do let me know by hitting that like icon. And if you want to support my channel to grow and help me to make more of these videos along with my other content, then hit that subscribe button right now before you forget. And if you don't want to miss out whenever I release a new video, then as well as subscribing, you can follow me on social media for notifications. My links are in the description below as well. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.